The air inside the Stephen Sondheim Theater didn't just carry the familiar scent of lilies and old velvet. It was thick with the weight of ghosts. Not the spectral kind, but the laughing, brilliant, cigar-chomping spirits of Broadway and Hollywood history. This was Rob Reiner's domain, a sanctuary of storytelling he understood in his very bones, and now it served as the vessel for his memory. The pews formed a living museum of American comedy, a heartbreaking tableau of a kingdom that had suddenly lost its king. The industry was already reeling from the staggering tragedy of December 14th, 2025, when Rob and his wife Michelle were found dead in their Brentwood home, a loss that left a massive hole in the cultural landscape. Today, however, was about the man himself. Mel Brooks, a titan hunched by a grief that seemed to absorb the light, sat near the front, his posture more slumped than the world had ever seen. Nearby sat a somber trinity: Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer, and Michael McKean. The Spinal Tap brothers looking less like rock gods and more like men who had lost their anchor. Meg Ryan sat beside Nora Ephron's children, her face etched with a quiet sorrow that felt like an echo of a perfect collaboration. This was a room of masters who knew how to command a stage and land a joke. But today, they only knew how to cry. Then, from the front row, a figure rose. He moved with the careful, deliberate pace of a man feeling every one of his 77 years. Each step an act of will against the crushing gravity of the moment. This wasn't the manic comic genius of the 80s or the polished Oscar host. This was Billy Crystal, and he looked smaller, as if the loss had physically hollowed him out. For weeks since the shocking news, Crystal had been a ghost himself, offering no tweets, no press releases, and no public comments. People expected a masterclass in comedic eulogy, poignant, funny, and perfectly crafted. They expected a performance. They were about to be proven profoundly wrong. As Crystal reached the lectern, he gripped its sides like a man on the deck of a pitching ship in a storm. He wasn't looking at the grieving faces in the crowd. He was looking toward the back of the empty balcony, searching for a familiar, booming laugh to tell him this was all just a setup for a gag. He took a shaky, audible breath that the microphone amplified into a collective pang of grief. The 60-year conversation was over, and for Billy Crystal, the silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The reality of December 14th, 2025, remains a scar on the collective heart of the entertainment industry. A night where the light of a Hollywood dynasty was extinguished in a manner so violent it defied logic. The Brentwood estate of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, usually a place of warmth and intellectual banter, became the center of a horrific investigation that began when authorities responded to a frantic call. What they found was a nightmare. Rob and Michelle had both succumbed to multiple sharp force injuries, a detail later confirmed by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner as a double homicide. The shockwaves were instantaneous, paralyzing a community that viewed the Reiners as the gold standard of creative partnership and stability. The details that emerged in the following hours only added layers of tragedy to an already unbearable situation. The primary suspect taken into custody was their own son, 32-year-old Nick Reiner. Reports surfaced of a final, public confrontation that took place earlier that evening at a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. Witnesses described a heated argument between Rob and Nick, a moment of friction that seemed to boil over after years of private struggles. For those who knew the family, it was a devastating realization that the very man who spent his life directing stories of love and reconciliation had met an end rooted in such profound domestic discord. As the news spread, the gates of the Brentwood home were soon covered in tributes, but the industry itself went silent. There were no immediate jokes, no clever anecdotes, only a heavy, suffocating disbelief. The tragedy didn't just take a filmmaker, it took a patriarch. Rob Reiner had recently completed work on a highly anticipated concert film for Spinal Tap, a project meant to be a celebration of his comedic roots, now indefinitely shelved as the world grappled with the violence of his exit. This was the context that Billy Crystal carried with him to the stage of the Sondheim Theater. a burden of grief so specific and so jagged that words seemed almost insufficient to cover the wound. The public and the press had clamored for a statement in the weeks leading up to the memorial, but Crystal had remained in a state of total isolation, a ghost of his former self. He was navigating a world where his limb had been amputated without anesthetic, left to figure out how to speak when the person he usually spoke to was gone. This wasn't just the death of a celebrity, it was the collapse of a foundation. As he stood before that silent room, the audience knew they weren't just witnessing a eulogy for a director, but an autopsy of a friendship that had survived every Hollywood storm, only to be ended by a tragedy no script could have ever predicted. In the quiet of the theater, Billy Crystal finally lowered his gaze to the front rows, looking directly at Mel Brooks and the others who understood the unique burden they shared. He spoke of their fathers, the legendary Carl Reiner and the jazz producer Jack Crystal, two giants of a different era. To the outside world, it appeared as though Rob and Billy had been born on third base, but Crystal challenged that perception with a raw, insider truth. Being born on third base meant seeing the pressure on the pitcher's mound from day one, hearing every heckler in the cheap seats, and living in constant terror of being picked off. Rob was the only other person on the field who knew exactly, precisely what that felt like. Their connection was forged in a secret language that required no explanation. They both lived with the desperate, all-consuming need to make these titans laugh, not just as fathers, but as peers. Crystal recalled a pivotal moment when he was just 22, invited to a poker game at Carl Reiner's house. It was his audition for A World of Giants, a room filled with figures like Mel Brooks and Norman Lear, who sat smoking cigars and eating deli platters. In the corner, not playing but watching with intensely focused, terrified eyes, was Rob Reiner. At that moment, Rob was a young man with a wild halo of hair, caught between awe of his father's ability to hold court and a desperate urge to be the one telling the story. When Billy sat next to him and made a simple joke about the Knishes, a silent recognition passed between them. It was the meeting of two spies from the same country in a foreign land, an acknowledgement of what it cost to survive in the shadow of legends. This was the bedrock of their 60-year bond. Not the fame or the accolades, but those insecure, unformed foundational moments that forged a connection stronger than steel. They were two neurotic, egocentric, emotional Jewish guys from New York who had known each other since they had acne. They didn't just work together, they grew up together, navigating the transition from being the sons of to becoming the patriarchs that the rest of the industry looked to for guidance. It was a friendship tested by fire and fortified by the shared understanding that only they knew the true price of the laughter they created. Years later, that foundational bond translated into a creative partnership that would redefine the romantic comedy genre, but it was never a path of least resistance. Billy spoke of their collaboration on a little movie titled When Harry Met Sally, a project that has since become a legendary piece of cinema history. People often asked him if the famous deli scene was his idea or Nora Ephron's, and they were usually surprised by the truth. They were filming in Katz's Deli, a place that smelled of pickles and history. And while the scene was funny, Rob had a pained, constipated look on his face. The look he got when something was 98% right, but missing the final 2% that would make it immortal. Rob walked Billy away from the crew, smelling of the coffee and anxiety that defined his presence on set. He challenged Billy to find the truth of the moment, insisting that a New York guy like Harry wouldn't just be silent after such a public display. He needed a reaction. As the crew waited in expensive silence, it was actually Rob's mother, Estelle Reiner, who provided the spark by mumbling the now iconic line, "I'll have what she's having." Rob didn't shout or celebrate. He simply kissed his mother on the cheek and told Billy that the secret was simply to listen. This story served as a perfect miniature of their entire creative life, an obsessive, relentless pursuit of the perfect moment. Rob was a director who trusted his actors enough to wait for magic to strike, a man who listened in a business full of people who only wanted to hear their own voices. He listened to writers, to the key grip, and most importantly, he listened to his own big, booming, insecure, and brilliant heart. He directed and lived from that heart, and as Billy spoke these words, his voice grew thick with the realization of how rare that quality truly was. The friendship was never easy, because it was real. They fought like brothers, fueled by ego and passion for their craft. Billy recalled a screening room battle over the ending of A Few Good Men, where they screamed at each other for 20 minutes in the dark, leaving the editor wishing the earth would swallow him whole. They stormed out in silence, but by the next morning, the phone rang with Rob's booming yellow, followed by a simple invitation to get some eggs. Eggs were their peace treaty, a silent acknowledgement that the work was important, but the brotherhood was untouchable. This revelation of their friction and their passionate, craft-driven battles only served to deepen the room's understanding of their bond. It was never a fairy tale friendship. It was real, tested by fire, and fortified by breakfast food. Billy shared a story of a time when they went 3 months without speaking more than a few words. It was during a dark period following the death of Billy's father, a time when the world had turned gray and the phone went unanswered. Rob, being the force of nature he was, didn't just call, he showed up. He arrived at Billy's front door carrying 2 giant, greasy paper bags from Langer's Deli. He didn't offer platitudes or demand conversation. He simply walked into the kitchen, unwrapped 2 enormous pastrami sandwiches, and sat down. They spent 2 hours in total silence, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythm of a shared meal. When the sandwiches were gone, Rob squeezed Billy's shoulder, whispered that he was sorry, and walked out the door. He knew that words were useless in that moment, but he made sure that Billy wasn't quiet alone. As they got older, the fire of their arguments cooled into a warm, steady glow. The conversations transitioned from box office numbers to cholesterol numbers, and from scripts to stories about their grandkids. They became the old guys sitting by the pool, showing each other pictures on their phones like a couple of old ladies. But after Carl Reiner passed, a piece of Rob went with him. The light in his eyes dimmed, and he felt unmoored, realizing that the safety net of the previous generation was gone. He had spent his entire life being Carl Reiner's son, and suddenly he was just Rob, navigating a world without his North Star. He called Billy the day after the funeral, his voice small, a sound Billy had never heard from that booming man. He told Billy that they were the patriarchs now, the ones people looked to. It was a realization that scared him, yet it only tightened the link between these 2 men who were now the keepers of the flame. They were no longer just friends. They were the last witnesses to each other's history. Their last conversation took place just 2 weeks before the tragedy, a simple phone call that was never meant to be a goodbye. Rob was characteristically booming through the line, recounting every single play of a 1969 Mets game with the passion of a biblical scholar. Billy laughed because he had heard it 100 times before, but Rob's pure, unadulterated joy remained as infectious as ever. Right before they hung up, a small pocket of silence opened, and Rob said, "You know, I love you, man." It was a rare moment where the sentiment wasn't buried under an insult or a gag. It was plain, undisguised, and simple. Billy said it back, and they hung up, leaving those final words to settle as an accidental gift of grace. Now, standing at the lectern, Billy stared down at the casket adorned with a simple blanket of white roses. His voice broke completely as he admitted he would give anything for one more phone call, one more terrible movie idea, or one more pastrami sandwich in the quiet. He took a deep, shuddering breath to compose himself for the closing line of their 60-year dialogue. He referenced the wisdom Nora Ephron had written for them in When Harry Met Sally, about wanting the rest of your life to start as soon as possible. But Billy offered a deeper truth. The real love story is the 50 years of conversation that follow the start. It is the shared secrets and the knowing that there is one person who gets the whole joke. Looking directly toward the casket, Billy spoke across the veil, telling Rob that he had been the rest of his life since the moment they met, and he didn't know how to start this next part without him. The tribute was complete, but the man was not finished. Instead of returning to his seat, Crystal walked with a slow, heavy gait toward the casket as the audience of accomplished artists sat completely undone. Mel Brooks was openly weeping into his hands, and Christopher Guest stared ahead with a single tear tracing a path down a face of stone. Billy reached the wood, placed his hand gently upon it as if to check for a pulse, and leaned down. The microphone, still live, caught the faintest, heart-shattering whisper that carried to every corner of the theater. He whispered, "I'll have what you're having, my friend. I'll have what you're having." He stood there alone on a stage full of ghosts, saying goodbye to the other half of his soul, while the room understood they had just witnessed a final, perfect, and heartbreaking collaboration. The silence that followed Billy Crystal's final whisper was not empty. It was a heavy, resonant space filled with 60 years of history, laughter, and the echo of a booming voice that had finally gone quiet. As the curtain falls on the life of Rob Reiner, we are left to contemplate a legacy that defined the very soul of American storytelling. He was more than a director or an actor. He was a passionate, brave citizen of the arts who lived and worked from a place of radical honesty and immense heart. The vacancy left by Rob Reiner is more than just a seat at a poker game or a name on a movie poster. It is a profound shift in the cultural landscape. He reminded us that the pursuit of perfection is a noble obsession, and that the greatest magic happens when we simply choose to listen to one another. While the tragic circumstances of his departure remain a source of deep pain for the Hollywood community, the tribute provided by his closest friends serves as a testament to a love that transcends even the darkest of endings. Rob and Billy showed us that a true friendship is a non-stop conversation, one that includes the screaming matches in screening rooms and the silent sandwiches in kitchens. It is a bond that survives the loss of parents and the daunting transition into becoming the old guys. Today, as we remember the man who gave us the "I'll have what she's having" moment, we realize that we were the ones invited to the deli, privileged to witness a lifelong collaboration that turned the messy, neurotic truth of human connection into something immortal. As we move forward without his North Star, we are challenged to keep that conversation going. We are reminded to cherish the phone calls that seem routine, the arguments over baseball games from 50 years ago, and the friends who show up with a paper bag of food when the world turns gray. Rob Reiner's story is complete, but the echo of his booming yellow will continue to ring in the hearts of those who knew him and the millions who were touched by his vision. Thank you for joining us on Starlight Remains as we honored this legendary life. If you were moved by Billy Crystal's tribute, please share your favorite memory of Rob Reiner's work in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the lives and legacies of the icons who shaped our world.